Well, what do you say about the concerns about quote unquote debt trap diplomacy? I think often the example of railroads between Kenya and maybe Ethiopia get brought up, where it's the idea that if China gives a big loan to a country to build a piece of key infrastructure, and then the company can't pay the loan back, then China takes control of that key infrastructure. What do you say to that argument?
Bollocks.
Yeah.
That's what I say to that argument. And this is one, I've got some strong views on this, as you've probably gathered. So the Chinese government has propaganda talking points. They're not the only ones. And if the American government has one talking point that keeps coming up, it's this argument that China is engaged in debt trap diplomacy, right? It just rolls off the tongue. It really is a US government talking point. Academic studies have been done by people completely independent. They've looked at all these countries, and this argument that it's like a drug, right? We're pushing this debt on you, and then you become addicted to it, and you're in our power. There's very little evidence that actually backs up that argument. You think about it, Dougal. If I'm the lender, you're your own country. I give you a lot of money. We build a port in your country. Well, who's at risk? My capital is in your country. You've got entirely jurisdiction. If you want to nationalise that asset, gosh, I am in a hugely vulnerable situation. What am I going to do? Send in the army if you choose to do that? So actually, the people who have the power in that situation is in fact the host country. It's not like a drug that they become addicted to it. And in any case, economists have looked at the numbers involved in terms of the share of debt that a country owes to China. And Chinese debt is not the chief is not the driver of debt in many of these vulnerable countries.
Well, I have heard from different people, just in conversations, that the US has previously done debt trap diplomacy in South America. You're going to have to fact check me on that and leave it in the comments. But finally, the final thing I want to talk about is the Xinjiang camps.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of noise about the Xinjiang camps, and it's hard to find truth with the Chinese government, which is not that transparent. I mean, I was in Shanghai a few months ago and talked to the AFR correspondent Mike Smith,
right,
who participated in a media tour, which went to one of the camps facilitated by the Chinese government, and it looked apparently a lot like a kind of set up, a fake camp. They got to talk to a couple of the people who were there, who looked like they were just reading off lines and pretending to be happy, stuff like that. So for people who don't know, it's like Xinjiang is basically the Muslim, it's a majority Muslim province in China, and China talks about these vocational or re-education camps as de-radicalization of the population. Started a few years ago, estimates are about 1 million people are there, but then other people say it's more like a prison, and they're not there of their own free will. And that the one last piece of context is last year there was a dump of what's called the Xinjiang Papers,
right?
Which apparently are official government documents. The Chinese ambassador to the UK denies them. I think, quote unquote, called them fake news.
Heard that before. Who else says that line? Yeah.
Well, it's one of our friends of the channel, Donald Trump. But what do you think about the Xinjiang camp? Because if the rumours are true, and it would be very concerning.
Oh, absolutely. And I guess my take on this, I'm an economist, so I don't claim to specialise in China's minority groups, but you do get to a point, I think, where the weight of evidence becomes so overwhelming that everyone should be listening to it. And on this particular issue, actually in Australia, we're really lucky. We've got more than one academic who specialise particularly in Xinjiang and the issues around there.
Maybe we'll talk to him.
I would encourage you to. They'd give you a better comment than I would on this. And the thing I note about those academics is actually on China generally, they actually have a spectrum of views. You've kind of got people who are more hawkish on China, and you've got people who are more dovish on China. But on Xinjiang, they are all absolutely in alignment that this is a human rights tragedy on a pretty darn large scale. This is extrajudicial detention. So, the Chinese government says it's to de-radicalise, all right, but gee, extrajudicial detention of hundreds of thousands at a minimum. That's pretty confronting for a country like Australia that's a liberal democracy. And even if the Chinese government says, well, it's our internal affairs, butt out, that doesn't really wash either, because we've got Australian residents and citizens, not a lot, but a few of them who are actually in these camps. So the Australian government, it's not something the Australian government can just, sit on the sidelines over. I mean, they've been pretty outspoken, and I think that's justified, frankly.
Is there any, I don't know, could Australia do anything conceivably?
Not a lot. I think the best, and so that's an argument to do nothing. Some people say, well, if we can't do anything, what's the point? Why make a big song and dance of it and perhaps put, economic links if we can't actually have much of an impact? I get the argument, but it's pretty extreme, and I think it's justifiable for the Australian government to do something, particularly when as I said before, we've got direct interests there in terms of our citizens and residents being tied up in them.
Okay, fantastic. Well, thank you for talking to us.